It's often debated in tech sales when to bring up pricing. Whether you're an SDR making a cold call and a prospect asks you, how much does this cost? If you're an account executive in a discovery call and a prospect is saying, hey, tell me how much it costs before you've really had a chance to do any discovery, I want to talk through today how I bring up pricing and also how I've seen others do it, so you're better equipped to handle this conversation, especially if you're selling something that costs $100,000+ or more. And even if not, pricing is always a sensitive subject. There's going to be prospects that, whether you're cold calling in a discovery call, like I mentioned, they're gonna say, hey, I don't wanna talk anymore until I know the price. These are the types of things that you have to navigate effectively, and there's a couple of ways you can go about it. So let's take the example of a cold call. If you're reaching out to someone, maybe you have a question or two, you have a decent conversation, and they say, hey, before I wanna hop on a broader call to learn more, I need to know the pricing. There's a couple of ways you can go about it, but really I like to use it as an opportunity to dive further into their use case and use the line or something to the effect of, hey, it's really difficult to say this early on how much it's going to cost. If I can better understand your use case, it's going to help me give you a more accurate idea of what the costs are. This does a couple of different things. Ideally, you can extract more information as an SDR for your account executive, but also you're going to use this as an opportunity to dive further into their world. How are they using it? Do they have a budget plan, etc.? And when you preface it by saying, hey, I need to know more about your use case before I can give you an accurate number, you can then dive into more questions about their use case, or conversely, go into questions about their budget. Like, hey, a lot of times when people are mentioning that, it's because they're working with a strict budget. Is there anything that you have that would prevent you from making a purchase, or any number that would prevent you from moving forward right out of the gate? And I think it's a fair conversation to have. It's not worth sitting there trying to tell someone that, hey, we need to know more, even though you know maybe it's gonna cost $100,000+. Like, if they don't have that budget, move on. It's not a qualified opportunity. But also at the same time, there's going to be prospects that if they hear $50,000 and you really haven't made a case or had the opportunity to tell them about the value that you bring to the table, then yeah, they may opt out of the sales cycle themselves when they haven't had a chance to see how valuable your product really is. So again, just recapping, you make a cold call, you get someone on the phone, you've had conversation, they say, hey, before we go any further, I want to know the price or I can't take a call. Again, the go-to line that I have is, hey, really understand, and I definitely don't want this to be something, if you can't afford it, it obviously doesn't make sense to keep talking, but it is really difficult to say this early on what it's going to cost without knowing more about your use case. So you could probe into the use case, or you could ask, by extension, oftentimes when people are asking me that, it's because they do have pretty strict budgets, especially right now in the economy. Is that something you're working against, or do you see the value in what we're bringing? There's many questions we can go there. I will say, if the customer or prospect is relentless and doesn't want to accept a meeting until they know about pricing, ideally your company website maybe has an overview of pricing, and that's how I'd set it up. If they absolutely want to see a number before taking that meeting, I'll go to them and say, hey, by the way, if you go to our website at blank.com, you can go to our pricing tab and get an idea of the overview high-level pricing. But that being said, based on our conversation, based on some of your use cases, I think certainly at the volume we're talking, the pricing could be different. And there may also be other features that could add value or otherwise. And it'd really be worth talking with our team if you have 30 minutes this week and go for that meeting, right? Now, as an account executive, say you've gone 30 minutes through the full discovery call, there's two things to consider, maybe two paths that I think about as an account executive. If you've done a lot of discovery, you realize that this is going to be a big number. You can tell based on the way that the prospect is talking that they probably want some sort of ballpark figure number to better understand if it's worth moving forward. Absolutely have the budget conversation. And it may even be worth throwing out like pricing again on your website. Hey, to give you an idea, you mentioned, there's probably going to be 300 users here. You can get an idea of the highest level pricing on our website, but at your volume, there's going to be discounting at play. But even let me get your reaction here and make sure we're not wasting anyone's time. At the surface level list price of blank per seat, is that a deal breaker? Is that even worth continuing the conversation? Again, I'm not saying bring that up all the time, but if you can tell that the buyer maybe doesn't have access to power, or they do, and they've already kind of talked about budget, and they've mentioned throughout the call a couple times budget is going to be a big concern, my personal preference, again, situational dependent, is to bring that up as to not waste your time. Don't have two more calls for them just to say, hey, actually, I've thought about it more. $250,000 is a no-go for us. We need to stop conversations. Good. You've just saved yourself 2 extra calls and a lot of time that you could have focusing on more qualified, more engaged accounts. Now, I will say, I think there's a very strong case to be made to also not give pricing until you've dove further into their use case in a lot greater depth. And I'll tell you, in my position right now, strategically going after accounts that are already using one element of my company's platform and evaluating another, oftentimes we do, as much as possible, try to wait on giving price until we have a real opportunity to dive into their use case further. And again, the highest level pricing is on the website. So in certain situations, I'll make it clear that they can look at that for reference, but especially with what we're doing, especially with the size of deals that we're talking about, I'm typically anywhere, I would say on the low side from a $50,000 deal to the high side to multiple hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on a 5-year type of contract. In this case, it's much better in most cases to actually wait and say, hey, even at the end of a discovery call, like, hey, I have a great understanding of what you're trying to do today. I have, I think, a good understanding of the problem statement, what I would like to do before we get too specific in pricing. From here, I'm gonna bring in a solutions consultant. Our next call, we really wanna dive into your specific use case, maybe have you walk us through how you're doing things today. At that point, I'm gonna be much better equipped to give you a very realistic and accurate estimate of what this might cost. And from there, we can make a true assessment of if it's worth moving forward or not. And again, many types of ways you can package that conversation, but what doing that does is, one, make sure your buyer is serious. If you have enough experience at this point to know that there's a real use case to be made, and you also know that you're gonna be asking them to pay 6 figures plus, I wouldn't wait forever. I would definitely get that pricing information to them rather quickly, but there are situations where maybe you use that second call before you give pricing as leverage to say, hey, let's go in depth on your use case. Who would want to be a part of this conversation? And when everyone's there, we can start to give them an idea of pricing and really see if it's worth moving forward. But the problem is, if you give pricing too soon and you haven't had a chance to dive into their use case, especially if it's a really, really painful problem, it may or may not disqualify you up front because the prospect may just at a principled level not like the fact that they have to spend $300K to solve this. Whereas the next call, if you spend say 60 minutes with a solutions engineer really diving into that problem, they highlight and now better understand, because they haven't had time to think about this in such great depth, that you have the opportunity to really potentially uncover that this is a problem that's actually costing them $1 million. And you can better quantify that on your end, such that now when you position a $300,000 product, it actually makes a ton of sense. And definitely comment below if you see it differently, if you have different experiences yourself. But I will tell you, as a rule of thumb, when you're working with rather complex technologies, and also when you're talking with a prospect that you can tell is tight around budget, you really want to do as best as possible a good job of highlighting the value of your product, and even before that, understanding their use case and pains associated before you drop a $50, $100, $500, $1 million offer in front of them for a product that may otherwise repulse them if you haven't done enough discovery and if you haven't positioned the product correctly. Also, especially at the SDR level, if someone really wants to know pricing, again, I talked through earlier in the video, but talk to them about how it would be beneficial to understand their use case in greater depth before you can give an accurate estimate. If they keep objecting, point them to the high level pricing on your website, but also ask them and go for that meeting once you've sent it to them because you've satisfied that request. As an account executive, I may be preaching to the choir here if you've been in the seat long enough, but if someone is talking pricing right out of the gate, I don't want to have a conversation until we discuss pricing. Honestly, more times than not, I found they're not even that serious of a buyer in the first place. But I do think it's reasonable if you do have a 30-minute call that a prospect may want to know pricing at the end of that call, at which point defer to your peers, the experience that you have or otherwise. I think it is worth bringing up pretty early on if they're budget conscious to make sure it's a good use of everyone's time, but also be wary of giving it too soon if, as an example, I'm selling a more complex product, I really have to dive into someone's world to understand where we can justify the value of a $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 product. And at that point, again, don't delay too long, but there are cases, even in the case of a 30-minute discovery call, where it's worth waiting if we can to really justify that value and really get the prospect bought into the pain that we're solving. But I hope that helps, and we'll see you in our next video. Thanks.